This is lecture number 6 in the endocrine system series. Our learning objectives for this are to describe the 3 mechanisms used to trigger the release of hormones, and the one that we are going to care about the most for the remaining lecture. And number 2, regarding hormonal mechanisms to trigger the release of other hormones, which kind of gives you a clue to the answer to number 1. Where do these signals originate? In other words, which organ is the boss of this pathway? All right, and so let's talk about this. Look, already you know that the endocrine system releases hormones. You know that hormones are essentially chemical messengers that tell a distant cell that it needs to get something done. And we talked about having receptors on those target cells, and those receptors can be located at cell membrane or cytoplasm or the nucleus. And so we want to know, well, that original endocrine tissue, how does it know when to release that hormone? In other words, fine, we know now that when the hormone binds to a receptor, stuff happens. And we can describe some of that stuff, right? At least with respect to membrane-bound second messenger systems. But what made that initial endocrine organ release hormone in the first place? Which general mechanisms are involved? We'll get to the details in subsequent lectures, but for now, what general mechanisms are there? And so that's what we'll get to here in this next slide. Which mechanisms promote the release of hormones? So we're going to just read this thing out left to right. And so if you start at the left, well, you have humoral mechanisms. What does that mean? Now, right off the bat, that term humoral can sound a little bit weird and goofy. It's not part of our everyday language. But what humoral mechanisms really mean, it means that the endocrine tissue itself is directly sampling blood. It's directly measuring blood. So if you look at this, one of the famous examples here is there's this thing called a parathyroid gland. And what the parathyroid gland does is going to regulate the level of calcium through its secretion, which is something called PTH, parathyroid hormone. Now, right now, the details of parathyroid hormone and how it does its effect, that's not so important. That's not the point. The point is more this. How does the parathyroid gland know when to release parathyroid hormone? Well, here it's pretty simple. What it does, it's measuring the level of calcium in blood. And when it measures the level of calcium in blood, if it feels like, whoa, man, we need to get a little bit more calcium in there, then it's going to release parathyroid hormone. And ultimately, what PTH will do, it will raise blood calcium levels. And again, how that happens exactly is beyond the point. That's not the point right now. The point then is what? How does the parathyroid gland know to release parathyroid hormone? It measures some concentration, the concentration of something in the blood. In this case, it happens to be calcium. And if it doesn't like what that level is, then it will release hormone. If it is satisfied with that level, then it will not release hormone. This is a humoral mechanism for the release of hormones. Now, the second mechanism, I think, it should be fairly intuitive. And so an example we're looking at here is in the adrenal glands. We'll spend more time in the adrenal glands later. But what this is showing you is that sympathetic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system will go off and it'll stimulate this organ. It'll release neurotransmitters, and then the adrenal gland will respond. That's what neural tissue does, doesn't it? Neural tissue goes off and it tells target organs what to do. It might tell muscles to contract, like in a somatic nervous system. It might tell smooth muscle to contract in an autonomic nervous system. And in this case, it tells these glands to secrete some hormone. And so the neural regulation is another mechanism that we have for the release of hormones. And the third one that we see here is a hormonal mechanism. Well, what does this mean? What it means is that, let's just look at this example, the thyroid gland. How does the thyroid gland know to release thyroid hormone? Who tells the thyroid gland to release another hormone, to release thyroid hormone? And the answer is, it's another hormone. So there are a bunch of hormones produced by the anterior pituitary, which we'll spend a lot of time in. And that hormone, I'll just give you the name now, it's called thyroid stimulating hormone. And if you think of the name, thyroid stimulating hormone, what does it do? Well, the name would suggest that it stimulates the thyroid gland. And it does. Thyroid stimulating hormone is produced here in the pituitary gland, and it stimulates the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone. So again, the ins and outs of the thyroid gland, we can talk about that in a later lecture. Again, that's not the point. What's the point? How does a thyroid gland know to release thyroid hormone? A hormone tells him to. How does the adrenal gland know to release a hormone? The nervous system tells him to. How does the parathyroid gland know to release a hormone? Well, he tells himself based on measurements of stuff inside the blood. Okay, so these are the 3 mechanisms. Now, the reason I have this third hormonal mechanism here in a box is because this is the thing that we're going to spend a lot of time on. In later lectures, we're going to see this hypothalamic pituitary system and how that relates to the release of a whole bunch of different hormones out there. And so when I put this in a box, I don't want to tell you that it's the most important. I can't reasonably tell you that it's more important than these other mechanisms. It's just not true. But what I can tell you is that there's just a lot more stuff to talk about mechanistically when we deal with this particular thing right over here. Okay, so we're going to spend a lot of time on the hormonal release of hormones. So in this picture, while we're at it, what I want you to see is the hypothalamus. You've heard me say already in lectures that the hypothalamus is considered to be the king of the endocrine system. It doesn't mean he's the king and micromanages all aspects. That's not what it means. It means that overall, the hypothalamus is in charge of things. The pituitary gland is this guy right over here, and you'll see here on this picture, there's this kind of pinkish part and this brownish part, at least in this illustration. And we're going to see that there are two parts to the pituitary gland. So that's going to bring us into this next slide. And when you look at this next slide, what I want you to see is the hypothalamus is right up here. And the hypothalamus is located right in this section. This part right here is the hypothalamus, and down here is the pituitary. And again, there is one part of the pituitary here and another part here. Now, the way this artist is showing it is they're showing you that this part here, where my cursor is running, is the anterior pituitary. This part in the back is the posterior pituitary. It's also labeled here, right? Anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. And so all I want you to see for right now, again, we're going to spend more time on these parts, but all I want you to see right now in this particular slide is that the hypothalamus has actually this weird network going down to the anterior pituitary. What are these things? These are capillaries. And so there's actually a capillary bed right over here, and I'm going to label this capillary network number 1. This is where the hypothalamus will dump hormones into the blood, into the capillaries. From there, whatever's in those capillaries will travel through these particular pipes, these so-called portal veins, and then from there, it will reach the anterior pituitary. And at the anterior pituitary, we reach another network of capillaries. So this is capillary bed number 1. This is capillary bed number 2. So here, the anterior pituitary picks up those hormones that came from the hypothalamus. And then what it'll do is it'll say, okay, that's cool. I just received a hormone from the hypothalamus. That is now telling me that I need to produce something else. And then the anterior pituitary will produce other hormones that dump into the system, which then goes out to the rest of the body. Okay, so we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. For now, the organization of the endocrine system, the hypothalamus itself is the king, the pituitary is the wingman. I don't know if that's the best terminology to describe it. Wingman may not even mean anything to some of you guys, but for lack of a better term for now. So the hypothalamus is the king, the pituitary gland is the, partner in crime, the number 2, the top lieutenant to this guy, the general. I guess there's a lot of different analogies you could use, but make no mistake, the hypothalamus is in charge, but he often will go through the pituitary gland. We'll see that the pituitary gland has an anterior and posterior part, and they have fancy names because that's what we do in biology. The anterior part is called the adenohypophysis. The posterior part is called the neurohypophysis. What word do you see in common? It's hypophysis. So hypophysis is just another name for a pituitary gland. The adeno or adeno hypophysis is considered to be more pure glandular tissue. And then the neural hypophysis, as the name would suggest, is considered to be an extension of neural tissue from the hypothalamus. And then as the hypothalamus and pituitary gland have their method of communication, eventually signals trickle down to the endocrine glands themselves, which are the workers, like the thyroid gland, like the adrenal cortex, for example. And those endocrine glands make a bunch of hormones that then go to other tissues, which then are the beneficiaries. If you want to see that visually, we can look at it this way. The hypothalamus has a certain line of communication to the anterior pituitary, and we got to talk about that. And that anterior pituitary then communicates to other endocrine glands, which then produce hormones which go to tissues. On the other hand, the hypothalamus communicates to the posterior pituitary as well, too, through a separate route. And the way that looks here, this is the hypothalamus communicating with the anterior pituitary through this portal system. A portal system is 2 capillary beds connected by a blood vessel or blood vessels. So this is an example of a portal system. The posterior pituitary, you'll see there is no portal system here. There is no connecting blood vessels to connect this capillary system with that capillary system. So a little bit more questions we have to answer. How does the hypothalamus communicate with the anterior pituitary? And the answer I just gave you is through the portal system. If that doesn't mean a lot to you right now, don't freak out about it. It's not a big deal. You're going to hear me say that a lot more as we get into specific hormones. But I want you to see the hypothalamus produces hormone. It dumps it into capillary bed number 1, which travels through the portal veins, arrives at anterior pituitary, which then, through capillary bed number 2, which then produces other sets of hormones, which then dump into those capillaries, which eventually make their way out to different endocrine glands. How does the hypothalamus communicate with the posterior pituitary? Well, I think we've got a good picture, and let's see. There's a good picture right over here. It's through this neural pathway, and this is a neural pathway. We'll answer this. We'll talk about this a little bit more in our next lecture. But this pathway right over here is called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. I know that's a mouthful, but if you break it down, hypothalamo means hypothalamus. Hypophyseal means hypophysis. Remember, hypophysis is another term for pituitary. So through this pathway, through this neural pathway, that's how we communicate from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. Okay, so let's come on back to this slide. All right, I think that's going to wrap up this lecture. So number 1, describe 3 mechanisms used to trigger the release of hormones. Well, we described those things, right? We said that there were humeral mechanisms, there were neural mechanisms, and lastly, there were hormonal mechanisms. We will spend the most time on which one of those, and that would be the hormonal mechanisms. Does that mean that mechanism is most important? No, that's not what it means. It just means there's just more stuff to talk about there. All right, now regarding hormonal mechanisms, which is the one we're going to spend most time on, where do these signals originate? Well, generally speaking, those things are going to originate from the hypothalamus. So in other words, which organ is the boss of this? It's going to be the hypothalamus. Okay, that'll wrap up this particular lecture.